this is essentially a 2-person or 2-team game. So if you're playing with 4 players, you're gonna have 2 players that are on the same team. And something I really like about making these videos is that it's often these smaller games that end up impressing me the most, because they do fly under the radar a little bit and don't get quite as much attention as those bigger games. But there are quite a few gems here, and they often do pop up in these smaller games, which is also one of the reasons that I think it's super valuable to subscribe to this channel, because I will point these games out. And just like the other game, Kathmandu, that I pointed out this week that looked like a fantastic game with an easy to learn rule set, I think this falls into that same sort of category where it's offering you a really excellent game with a very simple rule set. But I do think there's a little something extra special with this one, which is the reason that I'm making this one my own personal pick of the week. And that reason that I am making this one my pick of the week is that I think it has a set of mechanisms used in a really innovative way that makes the game flow really nicely, while also creating a game that looks like a ton of fun. And as I said, this is not a complex game by any means when it comes to the components, because this one is just essentially a deck of cards with different numbers on them. But there is an interesting pattern here, because each card can have up to 2 numbers, with one of the numbers being the mirrored inverse of the other. So for example, if you have a 79 on one side of the card, then the other side is going to have a 97. And one thing that you might have noticed is that one of these numbers is upside down depending on which side of the table you're sitting at, because each player is going to be sitting on opposite sides of the table, and then they're only going to be able to use the numbers that are facing their direction. This means that whenever you're putting a card out with a number that you want, you also have to consider the number that you're giving your opponent access to. And of course, the whole point here is that you're trying to chain together the longest chain of cards consecutively in order to score more victory points. But something to note here is that you only want to do this in one direction, because one player is going to be playing as the vertical player while the other player is playing as the horizontal player. So what that means is that you only want to chain those cards together in that direction, while simultaneously trying to limit those opportunities for your opponent. And to do this, players are going to be taking turns, and on a turn you basically have one of 2 actions. You can either play a card into space, which is the main area of the board, or you can play a card adrift, which is a set of cards that are off on the side of the table. And the drift area is just a set of cards that are available to both players, and if you play a card there, you'll be able to take a card from the drift area into your hand, securing it as your own card, or instead you could choose to draw that card from the deck if there's nothing in the drift that you want. But of course, the main thing you want to do is to play cards into space, because that's the way that you're going to be earning victory points. But in order to do that, you must connect the card that you're playing with another card. But the nice thing about this is that you can either connect it with a card that's already in space, or if there's a card in the drift area that you can connect to, you can connect to that, starting a whole new group of cards. And if you have multiple cards in your hand that you can connect together consecutively, you can play all of those cards at once into a new group, or connecting it with another area out on the board. And it's this efficiency of card play that I think is really interesting because of the way that the game scores. And the way that scoring works is that it's triggered by the number of cards in the group. The first trigger is at 6 cards, the next trigger is at 10, and then the last trigger is at 14. And it's because of these different trigger points that the timing of how you play your cards is so important, because you're going to be wanting to trigger those groups of cards where you have the most cards there, and you're going to be trying to not trigger those groups where your opponent might have a lot of cards. And once you reach that first group of 14 cards, that's also going to trigger the end of the game. So after scoring that group, you're going to see who has the most victory points, then that player or team is going to win the game. And because one player is playing as the horizontal player and the other player is playing as the vertical player, it's super easy to see which player has the lead in each individual group, since it's going to be longer or wider depending on which player is in the lead. Once again, just a really small design detail that just makes this game a lot nicer to play. And of course, if you're interested in this one, you can go ahead and find a link to the campaign in the description below, and you can click on that notify me button if it hasn't launched yet.